Well, thank you, Dave, for that incredible introduction. And I just have a small caveat I need to share with you all, that I live in Kathmandu at the moment, and at the moment it's about 3 a.m, so I'm feeling a little weary, so I hope I can do justice to the introduction that Dave has just given me. I also would like to say that when I understood that I was giving part 2 of what was actually advertised on the website as a dialogue with Noam Chomsky, I almost had a cardiac arrest. I mean, he was one of my heroes when I was a student. I read everything that he had written, and the idea of having a dialogue with him was absolutely terrifying. But this is the sort of dialogue I like, 1 month apart, and him not here, and me having the last word. So I think, well, hopefully I can do a bit of justice to it. And of course, as Dave mentioned, I'm not going to speak from the same perspective necessarily as Professor Chomsky, much more of a field-based perspective on humanitarian action. Nevertheless, I do, of course, share many of his skepticism, much of his skepticism about this term humanitarian intervention. I think, in fact, we should do away with it altogether. I prefer to talk about military intervention, and I prefer to talk about humanitarian action. I don't think we should confuse the two because basically, as he said, it posits a humanitarian rationale for a military intervention, which may not necessarily be the case. And this term undermines it for those of us who actually need the term humanitarianism. Now, you may think that this is just semantics and what does it matter and what do people know about, the differences in the field, and do they care if the aid comes from the military or if the aid comes from a humanitarian actor. But yes, I would say yes, it is very important, because when we have to go in and negotiate access and security guarantees from belligerent parties, it is very important that we explain why we are there and what we are doing, and that we do what we say we do, because otherwise we lose the basis of trust and can very easily become targeted. And I think what's going on in Afghanistan has very much undermined this notion. It's not the first context which has, but it's the most current one where the use of the term humanitarian has been very much abused. Not necessarily for the intervention at all. I think the intervention was in self-defense by the US forces, and it was recognized as such by the Security Council. But what has passed for humanitarian aid by the international military forces is very far from being so. When pamphlets are dropped on towns saying that people will receive food aid and other good stuff if they report on movements of Al-Qaeda or of the Taliban or other opposition forces, when aid becomes a reward for intelligence, then suspicion, and especially when soldiers go around in white vehicles and without uniform, collecting intelligence whilst giving out relief, I won't call it humanitarian aid, relief, substances, then it does put suspicion on all of those who are trying to deliver humanitarian aid. And worse than the suspicion that it puts on aid workers like myself is the effect it has on villagers who are actually in receipt of this aid, because the opposition forces are not stupid, they know this occurs, and so they have subsequently attacked villages which have been in receipt of such aid because they know that it's been given, or they suspect it's been given in exchange for some information. So I really think that it's very important that we try to guard this humanitarian label for genuinely humanitarian action. However, I'm not quite as cynical as Professor Chomsky over all military interventions. I actually do feel that Somalia in 1992, the decision of George W. Bush to send in troops, was a humanitarian motivation. I mean, I really cannot think what other motivation there was for the military intervention that occurred. However, I think, as Chomsky would definitely say, it had disastrous consequences as the US forces and the UN forces went to war basically against General Aidid. I was in Somalia at that time working, and I remember the incredible naivety, the wonderful naivety in many ways of the soldiers when they landed. They wanted to be there, they wanted to save people who were dying of famine, and they couldn't understand why the Somalis were shooting at them. So, I think it was misconceived, it was very naive, but I definitely think it was motivated by humanitarian intentions. But unfortunately, the consequences were that it left a very bad taste then in in the minds of many states, who then resisted intervening in places like Rwanda, where in fact they could have put a stop to the genocide. If you remember, people suffering from the genocide were regrouped in stadiums and churches and schools and places, and where really it would not, perhaps, according to General Dallaire, who was the head of the UN at the time, it would not have been that difficult to have stopped genocide. But unfortunately, because of what happened in Somalia, I think the taste for it was gone. And two things happened. I mean, humanitarianism in a way became an excuse, an alibi at that point for governments to say, we are doing something in response to perhaps public outcry, you know, what are you doing about the situation in Bosnia? And so it became a way of looking like we were actually doing something without doing something in two ways. I mean, notably in Rwanda, President Mitterrand was asked during the genocide in Rwanda, what are you doing to stop what's going on? And he said, I've just ordered my government to give, I don't know, X amount of $1 million to these NGOs, these French NGOs like Médecins du Monde and Action contre la faim, to go in and to provide humanitarian aid. And this prompted Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, to take out a full-page advert in the Le Monde newspaper saying, you do not stop a genocide with doctors, i.e. we need political action here. It's not humanitarian action that can possibly stop a genocide going on. Then, funnily enough, in Bosnia, troops were sent in as well, but not to protect the civilians that were in risk of dying. It was to protect the aid convoys that were just trying to provide them sustenance in order to survive. So this was another use of the humanitarian notion to appease the public outcry to do something without actually doing what was really required. I mean, you don't protect the means and then actually ignore the ends. And we all know what happened in the enclave of Srebrenica when people were attacked and nothing was done to stop it. And then in the Rwandan camps a little bit later, yes, the French did finally send in Operation Turquoise, which certainly saved many thousands of lives, but it also allowed the army responsible for genocide and the Interahamwe, the militias, to then escape into Zaire, where they were able to set up shop in the refugee camps and control the refugee camps henceforth. So military intervention came in to stop the cholera epidemic, or try to alleviate some of the suffering caused by the epidemic of cholera and dysentery, which hit the refugees when they came into Zaire, partly because it was volcanic rock, very difficult to dig latrines. Cholera was endemic, and there was this massive outbreak that killed probably 50,000 people. So then military troops were sent in, but not, again, to fight the people responsible for genocide or to try and separate them from the bona fide refugees, but to fight a virus, which obviously can't shoot back. So it was on pretty safe grounds to look like something was being done. But the fact that nothing was done to separate the people who were responsible for genocide, which would have been possible in the early days, at least with the army crossed the border in their uniform. If the military forces that were in place at the time had managed to at least separate them from the other refugees, perhaps some of the militias that were also responsible for killing may have gone as well. We can't tell, but basically nothing was done. The army was able to take off their uniforms. They were able to ensconce themselves in amongst the bona fide refugees. And then for the next 2 years, aid organisations were left with this terrible dilemma whereby a lot of the aid, all the aid that they were bringing into the camps was being controlled by the same people responsible for genocide, who were using the camps as a rear base from which to attack Rwanda, kill genocide survivors that might testify against them in the future in court, and basically sabotage reconstruction. And of course, the outcome was that Paul Kagame took it into his own hands, and his army attacked the refugee camps two years later with terrible, terrible consequences for the refugees themselves. And I think we're still seeing the repercussions of a lot of this today in the fighting in the Democratic Republic of Congo, as the remnants of people who survived from these camps are still causing havoc in that region. However, I would say arguably the most successful military intervention that we could talk about for humanitarian purposes today was probably the British intervention in Sierra Leone in 2000. if you recall, the Revolutionary United Front, the RUF, had been perpetrating terrible atrocities against the civilian populations. I think the image we all keep in our head is of hands being amputated to stop people voting in the elections. But there was so many rapes and pillage and terrible death and destruction that had been going on. And there was a West African peacekeeping force in place, but it itself had become pretty much party to the conflict. And so then the British decided to intervene. And again, okay, it was a former colonial power, but still, I find it hard to see what real state interest the British had. I happen to err towards the fact that it was a humanitarian intervention. It also had a pretty positive outcome. I mean, the RUF were defeated, and peace has come back to Sierra Leone. So I think the Sierra Leoneans were pretty happy at the end of the day that the British did intervene. However, because there's always a however in my stories, the means and methods that were used by the British caused some problems for humanitarian aid organisations. And I think this example shows very much that there is often a clash we see when there is a military force on the ground and humanitarian organisations, because the logic is very different. For the British forces in Sierra Leone, the logic was that they needed to defeat the RUF. And to defeat the RUF meant that we needed to cut off all sources of support for the RUF. And of course, we all know that if you provide humanitarian aid to a region controlled by an army or a guerrilla group, there is nothing to stop those people from stealing some of the aid. Perhaps they're going to eat it themselves, okay, but perhaps they're also going to sell it across the border. They're going to buy arms with the money and the medical aid coming in. Certainly, I think it is a paradox of humanitarian action that we all have to learn to live with, that there are benefits that will go to a fighting force of humanitarian aid coming into a region. This is the price as a humanitarian we are prepared to pay. I think it's always a balance that we need to look at. How much relative harm are we doing? How much good? We're saving lives. What is the cost of saving lives? But it's very hard for humanitarian aid organisations, I think, to say, we will stop all aid and these people can be sacrificed for the sake of some longer-term peace down the road. And yet this was what was expected. We were told, aid organisations were told, to stop providing aid to the RUF areas because all sorts of aid was only going to strengthen them and only going to prolong the war. So I think for aid organisations that was absolutely unacceptable, and so they tried to circumvent in every way that this segment of people who just happened to be living there of no fault of their own could be sacrificed, if they were in desperate need of aid, could be sacrificed for the sake of peace further down the road. And this is a clash, I think, that we find all the time when we have peacekeeping operations or peace enforcement operations, military intervention alongside humanitarian aid organisations. So humanitarians are pretty much stuck, in the limits to what they can achieve. You can set up a refugee camp, you can make sure that 20 litres of water per person per day is being provided. You can undertake measles vaccination campaigns, meningitis vaccination campaigns, polio, you name it. You can make sure that every single person is receiving 2,000 kilocalories of food every day. You can make it at perfect sort of standards that are called the sphere standards in humanitarian action. They're the standards that we all should aspire to provide to refugees and others in need of humanitarian aid. But all of this is, in some respects, I won't say pointless, but if these same people are at risk of being killed or slaughtered by roaming militias or an attack on them directly, what you're doing is at best pointless in some respects if they're all going to die from violence. But at worst, your presence actually can persuade people or make people think that they are safe when they are not. And I think very much this was the case in Srebrenica, that aid organisations who were present, like MSF and ICRC, they posed questions to themselves afterwards. This enclave was supposed to be secure, and what participation did we have in giving that image to the people inside that it was secure by our presence? And in the Rwandan refugee camps, the same. I mean, maybe people didn't imagine that the camps could be attacked if there were foreigners there. But as the foreigners got on their planes to leave, because don't forget, as foreigners, mostly we can get on a plane to leave, and you leave the refugees behind, you have to wonder what responsibility do you bear for giving these people a false sense of security by having met all their technical functions or technical needs, biological needs, but you haven't actually met any of their security needs. So aid organisations find themselves in that situation where they say, do something, please, somebody do something. We don't have the capacity to to ensure security. And at that point, there have been many in the past who have called for a military intervention. And an obvious recent call, but I think one that all aid organisations will be unanimously opposed to, just simply from the practicalities of it, is the call by the Ethiopian Prime Minister very recently, Meles Zenawi, for protected corridors in Somalia. Yes, the famine in Somalia is absolutely awful from what I understand, reports coming out, and aid organisations have a big, big problem of getting access to these areas. But just imagine how there can be humanitarian corridors protected by African Union peacekeeping troops who can't secure Mogadishu at the moment, somehow forming corridors down. I mean, there's no way that this aid would not become attacked in itself if it was being protected by peacekeepers. So there are some very obvious examples, I think, of where it's just a huge impossibility to imagine a military intervention in defence of humanitarian ideals. But there are other cases where I think that, you know, as I said, during the Rwandan genocide, where something had to be done, and there should have been a military intervention in that case. So now I'll turn to what other ways are there to help those in need of aid, because as I promised you, I was going to talk far more about humanitarian action from my sense of it, from the ground. In contexts like Afghanistan, Somalia and Sudan, I think the best chance for aid organisations to be able to reach people in need of humanitarian assistance is to be independent of all outside forces and to be perceived as truly humanitarian, i.e. working only in the interests of those in need. And this perception is certainly more difficult when there are Western troops present, because whether you like it or not, all Westerners tend to be painted with the same brush, and if there's a Western military presence, it's much more difficult to dissociate yourself. So this brings us to the point of neutrality, the neutrality of humanitarian assistance. Neutrality has been under attack as a principle of humanitarian assistance predominantly since 2001, but it's always been very controversial. I myself, I will admit straight up that I wrote a background paper when I was with MSF calling for MSF to withdraw the word neutrality from its charter. I said MSF is not neutral, it hasn't been neutral in the past, and neutrality is spinelessness. You know, I remember the Bosnians saying, and I really understand their call, they say, don't give us your drugs and your medicine, give us guns. Your food, your drugs only allow us to die in good health. You know, this really resonated with me and thought, yes, there has to be more to be done. We can't just stand back and be neutral. But since 2001, it's also been very much dismissed by aid organisations as old-fashioned and morally contestable. Often the situation of the International Committee of the Red Cross during the Holocaust, where it didn't speak out about its knowledge of what was going on in the concentration camps, is invoked as a blanket. You know, you see where neutrality leads us. It is morally reprehensible. And then the killing of aid workers in recent times has also been cited very much as evidence of the pointlessness of neutrality. In any case, they're going to kill us, whether we try to be neutral or not. But neutrality, I have come to understand, because I can change my mind, not often, but I do, is not a moral position by any means, and it is not a principle to be upheld as an end in itself. Neutrality is very much a strategy to get access to people in need. It means putting aside your individual ideas about what is right and wrong in a conflict, but just focusing on the need to be accepted by both sides. So that it's fascinating reading the history of what ICRC and MSF were able to do during the Rwandan genocide, which is very well documented in a book by Linda Melvin called Betrayed by the West. And it's really incredible to see how by going out and sitting at a checkpoint and drinking beer with an Interahamwe killer, you could build a relationship whereby that same killer might give you a favour a day later, allow you to bring an ambulance full of wounded people through to the hospital so you could save their lives. Of course, you can say in the scheme of the whole Rwandan genocide, where maybe 750,000 people died, saving 10,000 in a hospital in Kigali is a drop in the ocean, and I will agree with you, it was a drop in the ocean. But what an important drop in the ocean for those 10,000 who were saved in that way. And I think that it's a horrific thing. A lot of people just have a moral objection. You cannot sit down and drink beer with somebody so evil. You cannot shake the hand of someone so evil. But that's not the point. The point is this going to get you access to the people who really need your assistance or not? Well, I'm all for neutrality today. And I think it's vital to talk about this because, as I say, it's really something that's been very much dismissed, and particularly by US NGOs, and particularly by the US government, who, well, there was, of course, George Bush's famous, you are either with us or you are with the terrorists, so complete rejection of the idea of being neutral. But it permeated right down to the field in Afghanistan in particular, where the hostility to the idea of helping people in Taliban or opposition-held areas was so vehement, and visiting prisoners and trying to uphold the Geneva Conventions was very, very much despised by many people. And then we had many statements by US generals about how it's the aid organizations who are going to win this for us. And there was Colin Powell's very famous speech about how NGOs are part of our combat team. And all this has done a huge disservice to the people in Afghanistan who have nothing to do with the war, but actually need humanitarian aid to stay alive and just happen to find themselves in opposition-held territory. Because aid organizations very much threw their lot in with the intervention forces. They abandoned neutrality. And when we look back, I mean, it's not that hard to understand why. I mean, when we think about the Taliban period from 1996 to 2001, it was extremely difficult to work there at that time. And for many people, the dictates on what women could and couldn't do, and the suffering of the population and the lack of human rights was really, really very difficult. I mean, women weren't allowed to work in any profession, and just to try and negotiate a space in a hospital for a woman who was having complications from childbirth to be seen by a doctor was extremely difficult for a long time. They just did not want any women working, and of course a man could not see a woman without her clothes on, etc. So it was extremely difficult. So it was understandable in many ways that everybody was extremely enthusiastic to see, the return of the rule of law to Afghanistan, or some, democracy, some human rights, some rights for women. And the Taliban also was very quickly defeated. Very quickly, Afghanistan was declared a post-conflict environment where humanitarian assistance was no longer needed. And there was a lot of multi-mandated organizations who work on both relief and development who raced in and were very happy to be helping the Karzai regime extend its authority to other parts of Afghanistan. But what happened? Well, the Taliban actually came back and started to flourish. And that left aid organizations in a very, very difficult position, because as far as the Taliban and opposition forces were concerned, the NGOs were seen to have taken sides. And the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, is one of only a very small handful of organizations who is able today to access some of the opposition-held areas of Afghanistan. So what I want to do, just with the end of my talk, I don't know how I'm going for time yet, is just to quickly outline how the ICRC, what neutrality means in practice, because it's a word that we can all think about what it means, but if I tell you concretely how the ICRC managed to make a space in Afghanistan in a neutral way, I think this is definitely the way forward for aid organizations. So ICRC in 2003 had this terrible realization that it was absolutely targeted like everybody else. A water engineer called Ricardo Mungia was in Kandahar, traveling to Tirinkot, when he was stopped. And he was taken out of his car, and he had a gun pointed to his head. And the man pointing a gun to his head actually was wearing an ICRC prosthesis on his leg. And it was obvious that the man had been told that he must kill a Westerner. But when he saw that it was ICRC, we think that's why he made a phone call on a satellite phone to his higher in command, who happened to be a man called Mullah Dadallah. Now, Mullah Dadallah also wore an ICRC prosthesis on his leg. Yet he ordered that Ricardo be executed, and so Ricardo was executed. So this came as an enormous shock to the ICRC. I mean, it's one thing to be caught in the crossfire. It's one thing to be killed in somewhere or hurt somewhere where nobody knows the reputation. But ICRC had worked in Afghanistan for 30 years. Everybody in Afghanistan had at one time or another been touched by the ICRC, a family member from the clinics, a mine victim. And so suddenly the link between being known, being accepted, and being safe was broken. And the ICRC really had to think, how was it going to what was it going to do? So it withdrew to just government-held areas, it stopped travelling in opposition-held areas, and it thought long and hard. And basically, it understood that perceptions of neutrality are not just tied to words, but are tied very much to action, and it needed to be very useful to be well accepted. Now, of course, it was already meeting and visiting a lot of the suspected Taliban and Al-Qaeda operatives who had been arrested and in prison. It had access to them. But obviously this was not enough to convince the opposition in Afghanistan that it was very useful to have a neutral, well, actually to convince both sides that it was useful to have a neutral intermediary in conflict, because it really was that because ICRC was visiting these Taliban and Al-Qaeda, a lot of people were accusing them of being Taliban lovers, and there was a lot of animosity on both sides. So ICRC's broad mandate very much helped it regain acceptance in Afghanistan. It began to, instead of Red Cross messages are sent from detainees to their families, so the families know where they are and how they are. And the ICRC started delivering these in person to the families of people detained. It met relatives of people in prison who talked about the hardships and the lack of medical assistance in many parts of Afghanistan. So ICRC started to tentatively try to get medical aid to these people, medically trained people, in areas that were off limits, in areas where there was no humanitarian aid going at all. And with the insurgency rising and the counterinsurgency rising, there was more and more needs. In Pakistan, it really upped its activities and its exposure because, as we know, a lot of the operations of the opposition forces in Afghanistan are conducted from Pakistan. So it was very important to go into households to deliver the message so that people really understood that the ICRC was neutral and there to help them as all. And for the Afghan authorities as well, of course, it took a lot of convincing of the Afghan authorities that ICRC was, that it was in their interest that the ICRC had contact on the other side. One of the very early breakthroughs was in the hostage, if you remember the 23 South Korean missionaries who were arrested in Afghanistan. The ICRC played the role of the intermediary in that hostage release. And that was a very important moment for both sides to understand that, yes, it's very useful to have a neutral party in a conflict. And from there also the ICRC started to exchange mortal remains. There were government soldiers who died in Taliban territory. Their bodies could not be repatriated back, so the ICRC would take these body parts back so that they could have a proper burial. Also would go into the morgue where a Taliban soldier was killed and take them back over the other side. And little by little, there started to be confidence and trust built up on both sides, so that at one stage even ICRC was able to negotiate with the Taliban to allow WHO to conduct the polio vaccination campaign in their territory without becoming attacked. So these were all incremental steps over the next few years which built up this body of reputation. So it's still very difficult. I won't say it's easy. ICRC does not have access to anywhere near everywhere, especially the threat of IEDs, of improvised explosive devices along the roads is of great concern. And so, ironically, is the ISAF killing of senior Taliban commanders in the field, because the turnover is very, very fast of people, and many of them have come straight from a madrasa in Pakistan. Many of them are very young. They don't know the ICRC, and security guarantees, sure security guarantees, are very, very hard to get in Afghanistan. So there's a long way to go. But nevertheless, the ICRC is definitely got access to more areas of Afghanistan than any other organisation, because it was not afraid to stand by its principles and go against the flow of what people, that people did not want any legitimacy given to the Taliban. And yes, that is a side effect of the humanitarian action we give, that yes, perhaps some legitimacy came to the Taliban through their dealings with the ICRC, but by the same token, the ICRC is able to engage in dialogue about suicide bombings and to try to curb the behaviour of of people on that side. In Darfur, similar. I won't just limit it to Afghanistan because Afghanistan is in many ways an exceptional situation. But in Darfur, it was very interesting to see also how, I think in America it was particularly the Save Darfur coalition that was mobilized, thinking, and there was such passion against Khartoum and for the people suffering in Darfur that many NGOs that came into Darfur simply aided people who were in the camps. They only aided the Africans who had been displaced by their villages. Now, it's understandable in many ways. These were victims of a horrendous counterinsurgency campaign. But by only aiding people in the camps, this became a magnet for people from the outer regions to leave their land and come into the camps because they had no other source of aid. So instead, the ICRC decided once, because it came in very early, it set up the camps, and as soon as other NGOs arrived, it started to push aid out into the rural areas in order to get aid to people so that they didn't have to leave their lands, because once you've left your land gets taken over by other people, and the chances of getting it back, etc., are very difficult. So the ICRC started to do that. But in order to do that, it obviously had to have acceptance from everybody, including the nomads, the Arab nomads, who so many people in the West had sort of characterised all of them as the Janjaweed, responsible for the terrible atrocities against the African farmers. Of course, this was completely untrue. There were many Arab nomads who also were affected very much from the conflict. There was no vaccination for their animals. The migration routes had been cut, etc. So ICRC started to make contact with them and started to give them services and offer them services like vaccination of their livestock, like wells and clean water supplies. And this way started to build, little by little, a reputation. And that reputation, that trust that was built, allowed the ICRC to then do these food convoys into parts of Darfur to help the African farmers not move off their land. So this was very important. And on the other side too, ICRC was, because it was working on both sides, it enabled it to start a flying surgical team, a field surgical team, which of course was really only needed by the rebels. The Sudanese government did not allow, did not need any medical services from the ICRC, but the rebels did. But because of the ICRC going ahead and really forging a neutral position and helping on both sides, the government in Khartoum realised, okay, this is of direct benefit to the rebels. They are saving the lives and operating on rebels in the field who will then potentially, be able to fight another day. But understood that also by being neutral, the ICRC had access to these rebels so that when a Sudanese army soldier was captured, that the ICRC would visit them, would allow them to write a Red Cross message to their family, and their status would be known, and ICRC would persuade the rebels to treat them in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. So I'll stop there. I mean, there are still huge challenges in these countries. In Sudan, since I was there looking at all of this, the situation's very difficult. There are people being held hostage. In Afghanistan, in Somalia, it's very limited access. But for me, it's clear that aid organisations today really need to rethink their approach to the provision of humanitarian aid. Neutrality is really not a moral position. It doesn't mean that you're spineless, that you can't, that you're putting the victims and their aggressors on equal footing. It is simply a strategy, and it really is the best one that I have seen so far in order to reach victims of conflict wherever they are. So, questions?
Dr. Terry is happy to take questions. We can probably go for 15, 20 minutes, so the floor is open. I'll try to repeat to make sure everybody can hear the questions to the best of my ability. Yes?
You talk a lot about the ICRC, which is a very Swiss organization, and Doctors Without Borders originated in France, and then there's a lot of American-based aid organizations. How would you say that the sort of the country associated with an organization affects their ability to practice neutrality as you have discussed it? Because I would say that, like, the world generally has a unique understanding of Swiss neutrality, but that a country like the United States, which intervenes militarily in a lot of different countries, might have more difficulty with that.
Could everybody hear that question? Do I need to repeat it, or is that okay? Why don't you repeat it?
Okay, the question was about how do other NGOs from other countries other than Switzerland, because Swiss neutrality is well known, and how do other aid organisations who are not from Switzerland, how can they be perceived as neutral? I think it's an excellent question, and I certainly think it would be harder in many ways for an American aid organisation to perhaps be perceived as neutral, because perception is everything. I mean, you can be acting as neutrally as possible, but if you're not being perceived as neutral, then that's where the danger lies. But I would say that MSF has been very successful in this, and France is hardly immune to meddling in the affairs of other countries. I mean, France is quite a belligerent country, and MSF has made a very active, it's been very vocal in distancing itself from all political sources, including to the point of its funding, where I think today it's up at about 90% of its funding comes from private donations of individuals, so that it doesn't rely on states. It's not beholden to states for its funding, and I think that's a unique position of MSF. Probably there are just a very few, like perhaps World Vision also has a huge basis of private funding, but that certainly allows it to distance itself by announcing this. Interestingly enough, the ICRC is very dependent on government funding, and the US government is the biggest donor of the ICRC. But it also its donation base is the signatories to the Geneva Convention provide money, and that money is untied. I mean, I think states are allowed to allocate aid to a region, but not any more earmarked than that. But for me, the question goes deeper. In America, it's very different history of relationship between the government and NGOs. I mean, just for example, the fact that you can have a head of an NGO go into the US government during a Republican or Democrat administration, change, go back into an NGO, and then go back into government again is something that you don't see in any other country. I mean, I'm thinking of Andrew Natsios, Julia Taft. I mean, people who have served in both a government and then as a head of an aid organisation. In France, you tend to see it the other way around. You see a lot of people who were involved in MSF go into politics afterwards. I'm thinking of Claude Malhuret, I'm thinking of Bernard Kouchner, etc. Mostly because they were very frustrated with the limits of humanitarian action and decided, no, I really want to change something, and it's not in the humanitarian realm I can do it, it's in the political realm. So they jump ship, but they only go one way. They don't come back again. And I think it's that mixing, it's incredible, the atmosphere in America, to see that even the debates in Interaction, the big sort of umbrella body of NGOs in Washington, a lot of organisations had no problem at all before the Iraq war, when the US government pledged money in advance, saying there's going to be refugees coming out, there's going to be, put in your sort of proposals for grant submissions. I mean, America was the belligerent party, well, with the Brits, but, the leading belligerent party, and yet US NGOs were happy to accept US government money to go in and sort of mop up the humanitarian consequences of this war. I mean, how can you possibly be perceived as neutral when you are like that? For me, I think there needs to be a huge debate in America. There needs to be a very big discussion about what role do NGOs want to play in America. Do they want to take more distance? And I think the other real problem for NGOs here is that what has happened is, if they have dared to speak out, what they've seen is that so much money has gone from the aid budget into the military budget. And so, I definitely understand that there is an issue for NGOs, that if they feel that they protest too much, they're just going to lose out to private security companies and the military, who are going to start being more and more involved in aid in different countries. So I understand that, but still, I think if there was some more solidarity and fight, they may be getting the public on side about where do you want your tax money going. It could do a lot.
I wanted to ask you, there seems that definitely needs to be good collaboration between the military guys and the humanitarian guys. because well, the humanitarian guys may need military intervention to protect them, especially the camps which hold refugees, or even the trucks bringing in and food and water to have them protected so that they're not used by the guys. And on the other hand, the military guys, they need to make humanitarian guys to make sure that the military people are not saying they are humanitarian people and having a double and hidden agenda. So there definitely needs to be a conversation and some sort of collaboration. And is that happening? If so, ignore the environment.
Okay. It's not really what I wanted to... Yeah, sorry. So the question was that does there need to be more cooperation between the military and the aid sector? Because what you've understood me saying, but in fact I wasn't saying, but what you understood me saying was that we need the military to come in and protect the aid coming in somewhere like the Rwandan refugee camps, and the military need the humanitarian action to help the population. So should there be more collaboration? But in fact, no. What the aid organisations, in a perfect world, we would just want the military to come in, resolve the security question and get out, really. I mean, in the camps, that was the case. It's extremely difficult to deliver any kind of humanitarian assistance when you are having a military escort. It's really a last resort, because there's no way that you can be perceived as neutral if you come in with a military, even if it's a UN military force. And you can become under attack. Once you have a gun protecting you, well, then you will be potentially attacked by a gun. So no, that the ideal would be that the military do the security stuff, which is the stuff that we can't do. We don't physically have the power to protect on the security side, but would leave the humanitarian action to us. And that's not what happens a lot of the time, and it's understandable. And when the military are standing there with guns, they want to be accepted. Part of their whole idea is about how to protect people is also to be accepted. Well, what's the best way of being accepted? The same way that we need to be accepted is to do something, to give something out. And so I totally understand why they would like to give out humanitarian aid and create some kind of relationship with the people all around. The trouble is for us is that it creates a huge amount of confusion, and often, well, the military are very in a natural disaster, no problem whatsoever. And the military is always, it's possible and very efficient at giving relief. But as for humanitarian action, no, it would be far better if that was left up to the humanitarian aid organisations.
How do you disengage after a conflict when there's been a tremendous input of humanitarian action? It affects the economy. It affects a lot of different people. So how do you find out when it's over?
When it's over? Well, for MSF there would be some indicators, normally on the medical front, as to, it really depends on the political situation. If, for MSF, if there is a hugely difficult political situation and it really feels that, well, in very rare cases, there have been a few, like in the Rwandan refugee camps, that by staying you are part and parcel of the very problem, then after the emergency period is over, then thinking about what is your presence doing. But I think always you need to intervene and try your best to find out if there are ways where you can ensure that aid is benefiting more the people you're intending to and not so much the people who are oppressing them. But in humanitarian situations, I think it varies very much. I mean, a lot of aid organisations today are very multi-mandate. They cross over from the sort of humanitarian emergency relief into areas of more traditionally would be called development, which is a far more politicised role. I think this is where they got into a lot of trouble in Afghanistan once the post-conflict, once the humanitarian disaster was said to be over. Aid organisations didn't feel that they needed to work in a neutral way anymore, didn't need to talk to the other side, to the opponents, and that caused a lot of problems because it went back to war. It probably wouldn't have had Afghanistan stayed on the line to peace. But it depends, because also MSF in different situations might stay in a context to deal with a specific health problem if it knows other aid organisations can't do it. But it really depends. I mean, MSF is very much a medical organisation. But having said that, it's stayed in Burma for the last 20 years. It really depends what sort of, doing HIV, antiretroviral treatments. It depends if other organisations are able to to take over or not. That will determine for MSF how long it will stay.
This might be a specific question, but it might also apply to other examples. But recently China and Russia vetoed any kind of intervention, international intervention into Syria, such as sanctions or military even. But in those kind of places where politics sort of stops any kind of foreign intervention, how can humanitarian action be made, especially since, you know, in places like Syria, everyday people are dying, but there's no help in getting to the country.
Well, it's not.
Can you repeat that one?
Yeah, sorry. The question was with Russia and China vetoing any kind of action, economic sanctions, etc., in Syria. How can humanitarian aid organisations go in when there is no help for the people in Syria at the moment? But it's not, I mean, aid organisations will negotiate with the government directly. Whatever happens at the Security Council level doesn't really have a great impact. It's up to every aid organisation to try to negotiate with the regime its own access. And so, for instance, the ICRC recently, I think, announced that it had meetings with the president, and that they did have access to, I think, to some of the prisons. I'm not sure, but yes, it's really very much a bilateral agreement between the aid organisations and the authorities in charge. It doesn't have to be the government. If a rebel area is held, it's with the people who are in charge of that, and then it depends to what extent the aid organisation is prepared to violate state sovereignty, like for instance, in Sudan in the 1980s, and 1990s, a lot of aid organisations that were working in South Sudan were not going via Khartoum. They were violating Sudan's sovereignty to come directly cross-border and work in South Sudan, which is, of course, risky, but it worked for many years like that in Sudan. So it really depends on to what extent the aid organisation is willing to violate that, and what sort of rapport they can make and what sort of agreements they can negotiate with those in charge of the territory.
No.
I know this is a very vague question, given your wide experience. Don't you conceive of a different way of organizing and coordinating this vastly complicated world? I'm probably proposing a kind of totalitarian centralization, which frankly you're most scared of. But is there something in the perfect world, institutionally at the international level, that might be an effective new tool to address emergencies and perhaps act in the context of neutral, genuine neutrality, whatever that is? I'm asking you, is there a different way we can do this?
Is there a different way to reorder the world
Yeah.
so that we can have a better system to respond to these crises? Honestly, I think whenever we try to renegotiate things, we lose space. So I just can't see that we can work with anything but the system we have and just try to improve the system we have, which we definitely could improve. I mean, there's no question about that. Yeah, it's far from perfect, but I can't really imagine what we could set up, or it would take some kind of such a terrible disaster to ever find the same will as in 1945 to perhaps set up a new system. It almost is doesn't bear thinking about.
Yes.
What role, if any, do you see humanitarian aid associations playing in social and economic development attempts?
So what role do I see humanitarian aid organisations playing in social economic development?
Yes.
Yeah. I think that it is very important that aid organisations try to separate their purely humanitarian action from the political, social, economic development activities because of this very reason. Because if you are dealing with social development, political development, development full stop, it's really a political process about empowering people. I mean, this is the jargon of development. We are empowering people. But empowering some people means that other people are losing power, Empowerment is a political process. And I think in humanitarian action, what we need to try, I mean, of course what we do is highly political. When you bring humanitarian aid into the midst of conflict, there are winners and there are losers from that aid. There are people that are going to be happy and people very unhappy. So that's a given. But we need to try to minimise the amount of impact we're having in that sense. And we need to just persuade the belligerents in the simplest possible terms that our only interest is in helping these people that are in this area of their control. And yes, they may try and control the aid, and then we have to weigh up and we have to try and put in different safeguards and different ways of monitoring, and we want to do an assessment of the needs independently of any minders, so they don't lead you to see this group of people in preference to that group of people. It's already so difficult to try and get humanitarian action right. Monitoring and evaluation of the action, not just whether this person has the exact amount they're supposed to in their food basket at the end of a distribution, but within the larger sense of, well, who is really benefiting from this aid, and is this aid being stolen once they get back home again? You know, this type of thing is already so difficult that that I think humanitarian aid organisations need to stick to that, and some of the questions about development, social development, etc., leave it for aid organisations at a later stage, perhaps. And I know a lot of people will disagree with that. They think you have a moral responsibility once you've intervened to then continue. But it does make it very difficult. And you know, some organisations are able to adapt to do the humanitarian stage and then go over to the another stage. But it's all become very mixed. I mean, you cannot be involved in state building and say that you are a neutral humanitarian organisation. And I think Iraq was very much a wake-up call for everybody on that front. I mean, you can't be surprised, you know, I mean, it was so tragic, the bombing of the UN building, but the UN is behind a whole state-building effort. You know, state building is a highly political process. And so this is always a dilemma for the UN. It's got its political body and it's got its humanitarian agencies like UNHCR, UNICEF, WHO. These are more of the humanitarian organs, and OCHA, of course, the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. But you try and explain to different belligerents in the field that, yes, we are from the humanitarian branch and we've had nothing to do with the Security Council decision that's just been made that you don't like. It's very difficult. So the more aid organisations can stay independent of that, the better it is, I think.
Yeah, I'm kind of struck by the fact that when people talk about humanitarian organizations today, I think they're primarily thinking of NGOs and governmental organizations, and I was struck by also just like how many of them there are. You know, like when I was thinking about the Haiti earthquake and how like literally organizations all ask for people money for funds and do this and like this other specialized thing and stuff like that. And so what do you think the relative advantages and disadvantages are of having like humanitarian intervention be kind of steered on the NGOs, kind of steered obviously governmental organizations, but maybe more of a
So did everyone hear the question about the proliferation of all these NGOs and what do I think about the vast number of NGOs in Haiti, etc., and what can we do to make them all sort of sing with the same tune, right? Very difficult. The analogy often made is herding cats, but I mean that is supposed to be the job of OCHA, of the Office of the Coordination for Humanitarian Assistance, and in many contexts they do a very good job. At least in saying, okay, who is working in each sector? It's all made into sectors now with all the water people meeting together and saying, oh, I will do this and this, I'm responsible for that, and the food sector, etc. What to say about it? I mean, you look at Haiti, it's not been a great success story. I mean, I definitely think there are too many NGOs on the scene, and it's very difficult to. I think there's a huge overlap and a huge wastage because of that. But yeah, and it's very difficult to get people working all in the same direction. But I think that we have to be a little bit careful with wanting to too much say that everybody has to follow the same tune. because certainly from an MSF perspective, often the tune that the vast majority sing along to is not necessarily the right tune. Because I think that aid organisations in general tend not to look at the larger political picture of what they're doing. They tend to run after the funds, and then you see that it's the very much the mediatised emergencies that get most of the aid, and how many of them are really there for just keeping their headquarters going with the money they're getting, as opposed to really doing a good job in the field. So I think that that's certainly a problem. And then you often see too that everybody's interested in funding the orphanage, because this is what draws the media attention. This is where you can get your flag seen on TV, and that's going to help your fundraising back home. But sanitation, building latrines, doesn't quite have the same sexy appeal, and so nobody's interested in building latrines. So, but this is the job of OCHA, and I think that they, in many places, do a good job in trying to channel these aid organisations into the right area. But there are a lot of ethical questions it raises too about aid organisations and how much money they raise for certain emergencies. I mean, I don't know if you all remember that during the tsunami there was such an enormous amount of money that came to MSF that after a few days MSF actually put out an appeal saying, stop, please don't give us money anymore. Everyone was aghast. How could an organisation say that? But it's because you cannot, I mean, in Indonesia, I mean, the tsunami victims, most of them were dead, and the risk of the public health crisis that everybody was predicting, apparently, I've just read this recently in the Lancet in the MSF's latest book that's come out, apparently the risk is way overstated. Dead bodies don't suddenly cause cholera in massive problems like that. So it's a finite amount of things that needed to be done at that stage. And had MSF continued to receive all this money for the tsunami, it would have felt obliged to spend it on things that it's well beyond its capacity or its interest or its function to do so. But how many other organisations do that? How many are actually honest with the people that have given them money to say, well, because I think it's very important. It's happened in Australia when I was living there, that there was a tsunami in Papua New Guinea, and aid organisations raised all this money. And they didn't feel any compunction to have to tell the people that, in fact, this emergency was overfunded, and they actually would really like that money to be spent on a forgotten project in Angola, which was just as worthy of aid. These people are human beings too. And I think the general public would be happy with that. But most aid organisations don't even bother to report back or say that we have too much money and we would like to divert it to one of our underfunded projects elsewhere. So there's a lot to be improved.
Let's take two more questions. Yes.
My question for you is, there's a lot of undergraduates here, and they might be thinking about, is this something that is a career option for me? How would I get involved? That sort of thing. I'm curious as to how this became a profession for you, how you went from being here to where you are, maybe not the whole story, but was there a key moment, and are there certain characteristics that you think could lead to success and satisfaction and fulfillment in this area?
Well, there's certainly a lot of satisfaction and fulfillment, a lot of frustration, but I think I run on anger and at the sense of injustice more than I do on other emotions. I mean, I always wanted to be involved in development, so apparently when I was 9 years old, I wrote this letter or this essay about the Kampuchean refugees, the boat people, and my mother reminds me of this, so obviously something was deeply entrenched there. But, I mean, for me it was definitely my time, I think, with MSF. I mean, I was a little bit disillusioned. I started in development, then I was whipped off to northern Iraq, so that was the end of development. From then on it was humanitarian relief. After the first Gulf War, I worked on the big food distributions. And even then, some of these questions start to tick over of, here we were giving out massive amounts of wheat flour to these Kurds who had risen up and then all their aspirations, they'd fled to the Turkish border. And the wheat aid, the food aid that we were giving them was an enticement to draw them back off the border and back into Iraq, so that nobody had to deal with the Kurdish problem. They wanted autonomy, but all they got was a no-fly zone. And so the questions started at that point. You sort of think, wow. And then I went to Somalia, and then we were working with these technicals. We were delivering aid with a machine gun on the back of our cars, and you think, how is this possible? And paying enormous amounts of money for security in order to deliver this aid. You can't escape the questions. I think if you're anybody with just a common sense and an inquisitive mind, the questions are all around you when you're involved in this. And a lot of people give up. A lot of people get very disillusioned. Some people just say, I'm only going to... I think probably the biggest, the most common reaction is to just focus on the technical side. Okay, I have this patient in front of me. I can fix this patient, and I'm doing good by doing so. But it was definitely in MSF that my politics and the politics of aid and organisations came together, and there it was fantastic. There's constant debate about what are we doing. I mean, endless debates, never a decision, but endless debates and a lot of fighting, and I just loved it. I thought it was fantastic. So that's my... And then the book came along on its own. I was the head of MSF when we pulled out of the camps, and so this ethical question, how can you renounce to help a population in the name of that population? You know, I mean, how can we pull out? And all the acrimonious debates we had within MSF and within the aid community about leaving the Rwandan refugee camps. So I wanted to find out, well, this is not new. This must have happened before. Why is it that aid organisations don't learn from the past? And so one thing leads to another.
How about students now?
How about students now? I think if you're really passionate and you want to do it, you'll find a way. I have to say it's a lot more difficult today than when I started. Even though I'd done development studies in political science, I mean, it's this catch-22 situation where you don't get taken by an aid organisation without experience, and you can't get experience until you've worked there. So this is something that's very, very hard to overcome. But perseverance and not allowing too many people to say no to you, but just sticking in there. And then once you're in the field, if you get to the field, then there is really then you can really see how the aid organisations work. And there is such a myriad of aid organisations, and there are some very good ones, and there are some mediocre ones, and there are some very bad ones, and you really need to see how they're operating and what their philosophy is, and try to guide yourselves accordingly.
Yes.
To tie this, I guess, a little bit back to Chomsky, what would you say is the best, you touched a little bit on this sort of distinction between humanitarian action and military intervention, but what would, in your opinion, be the best way of dealing with the sort of rising isolationism on both the political left and right in the spirit of humanitarian action?
The rising isolationism, well, in terms of the reluctance for military intervention, is there? It seems the military is, we're not doing humanitarian interventions, but doing military interventions. The military is pretty busy.
Amongst the people, amongst intellectuals, not necessarily amongst the political sphere.
Sorry, I don't catch what you're getting at. You think there's a rising isolationism, that there'll be less willingness?
No. There seems to be this, hearing Chomsky talk, there seems to be this sort of tendency towards isolationism, especially become more apparent, at least in the U.S., after Afghanistan, after Iraq. That, I guess my question is, in your experience, what would be the best way to deal with this?
Well, I mean, Libya, you've got Libya on the list as well there. I mean, I'm not sure that there is a rising, I mean, R2P, that obviously Professor Chomsky is very much opposed to, has gained, you know, it's a huge push for the responsibility to protect and to intervene. Of course, what happened in Sri Lanka, you know, you can ask about where would this apply, under what circumstances.
Maybe another way to frame it is that if you look at the Republican debates that are going on right now, and I think it's also reflected on the other side, there is the internal domestic economic issues are dominating. And there seems to be a reluctance to even talk about foreign involvement of the United States, and development assistance is crashing. So how do you keep people aware of a need for involvement in international affairs? Not an easy
Not an easy one, especially as I'm based in Nepal at the moment, and it's been a few years since I was in the US, so it is a difficult one for me to answer. Yeah, I really can't answer. I don't know what the huge debates are here at the moment, but when I look at Libya and I look at the rationale for saving the potential massacre in Benghazi, it seems to me that this was only 6 months ago. So of course there were other interests in involvement in Libya other than the people of Benghazi. Of that I am certain. And then of course the question is raised: why not Syria? Why not Bahrain? So yeah, it's how to put real humanitarian concerns back on the forefront and not necessarily economic interests. But how to do that, I don't know. I mean, for me, there's already a huge job for the NGO community to do in trying to refocus in on itself and say, okay, what do we want to be? Do we want to be people who carry out the foreign policy of the US government, or do we want to be independent aid organisations who are working for the good of people who are suffering in different parts of the world? And that needs to be the first step. I think the NGO community here needs to get its house in order and work out where it wants to go, and then perhaps start, making pronouncements to others about what they should be doing.
Maybe time for one more question. Does anybody have a question? The last question? Yes.
This is just going back to the idea of sustainable development. Even though I know you're saying to keep them separate. I was wondering what an organization like MSF does in situations where malaria is considered a pretty socioeconomic disease, and how you treat that and leave, and then it could very easily come back with no policy change. So how do you deal with situations like that?
I think every context is different. I think for MSF, and I'm speaking from a while ago, I haven't worked with MSF since 2003, but I think for MSF, there are certain situations where nobody is treating, certain diseases like sleeping sickness, etc. And for those reasons, that is the rationale in which MSF would be in a place. Or dealing with, malnutrition in India. There are medical reasons and medical emergencies that nobody else is sufficiently dealing with, and that might be rationale enough for MSF to go in and meet those problems. Exactly the same with HIV, AIDS. Where there is a huge problem where nobody else, for a long time, the idea of giving antiretroviral treatment to people was off the table. It was all about prevention, and it was all about treating the secondary infections that come with HIV. It was very much MSF that started saying, we can't do that. We have to start treating people, even if it means then that we are going to be there in the long term, because once you start antiretroviral treatment for people, how can you take them off it? It's for the rest of their life. So it does very much cut down that distinction between emergency humanitarian action and development, because definitely you're crossing over on many of these issues. In fact, it's a distinction we don't use very much, but it's more a distinction. I think we should see it as, when do you apply the principles of impartiality, neutrality and independence? When is it really crucial to do so? In a development setting, working with a government, doing capacity building is not, it's really your responsibility. It's not a problem. It just depends on how the people are going to perceive you. If you need to have access to another area where your work in that sort of, your support to the government is going to cause you problems trying to get access to those people who are dying over there, well, that's when you have to think differently about it. So it's more conflict, post-conflict, if you like, than sort of emergency or humanitarian development nexus.
Well, I can only say that if you're this articulate when you're jet lagged, I can only imagine what you must be like when you're fresh. So thank you very much.